we already have a question.
Oh, yeah.
Yay!
I
Does
just saw that.
anyone have any ideas on how to use QFT versus via distance learning? Can't talk apparently.
I'm
Yes.
just popping an answer in now. I saw a really cool example today.
What grade are you working with, Mandana? Eighth grade science. Okay.
And do you have a live platform? Do you have a Zoom or Google Hangouts, or is it all completely offline? Like the kids have to do it on their own. It's completely self-paced. So Zoom.
Are the students one-to-one? You have devices that they can use? Ooh, one-to-one and Zoom. Nice.
Wow.
You're almost there with them then.
Yeah, I would go back and look at the webinar recording from a couple weeks ago on the 5th and look at, because that was on Zoom, so you can see how, like, when we were pausing to use the chat box and when we were different things, we said, okay, do this part on your own and now share in the chat box. So you could use that as a model. That's nice to have Zoom and be one-to-one. What a gift. Or, well, it's a lot of work too.
Yeah.
I think too, and I'll mention this later, but there's Padlet too, which is like movable sticky notes, if you've heard of Padlet. So that's another good place. And even Google Forms, if kids are doing the QFT individually, you can compile their questions. So, and even the slides that I'm going to show everybody later will bring you through steps, and you could share the slide deck with kids individually on Google Classroom, and they can go through those steps on their own. But
yeah,
yes.
you could do it with Google Forms, and then you can always dump all the questions into one spreadsheet and share the spreadsheet with the students too, or break them up somehow and share pieces of them with different groups of students. So there's lots of ways you can use Forms and Zoom and Hangouts Meet to do all of that. Almost like they're together.
I've seen people use Google Slides too, and assign, like slide 1 is group 1, slide 2 is group 2, and then so that's a way of compiling in one place too.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, cool. Lots of good ideas. Did you have a question focus, Mandana, that you were thinking about for your questions? Particular topic that you're working on right now? So hey, thanks to everybody for joining us today. We have about 4 minutes, a little bit over 4 minutes until the top of the hour, and we'll get started with the webinar right at the top of the hour. But if you're just joining us, down here is the chat, and we're already having a really interesting discussion from one of our participants about how we can do this in at-home learning. So jump in the chat and join us there. Geologic timescale and evolution. Ooh.
I did
nice.
see the Library of Congress has some really amazing stuff from Charles Darwin's letters and collection and diaries. It's kind of cool.
So lots of ideas popping up there. So Nicole just asked about your phenomenon. So what kind of storyline, what kind of phenomenon are you working with there? And then another comment about putting events in order after you interview someone. Yeah.
Wow.
Makes me think of a project that will be coming up on one of our future webinars in May that has a lot to do with interviewing people and building timelines from those interviews. Little teaser there.
Nicole, you're going to share a couple places you like to go to find a Q focus prompt, right?
Yes, yes, and I linked them into the slide. So yep.
Definitely, those are some good places definitely to go and just see if there's something about geology or geological time maybe.
Yes, definitely. It's nice. So many people are brainstorming things on the internet, so there's no shortage of ideas.
Hi.
Hello. Hi, Tori.
Hi.
Tori teaches 8th grade at my school.
Hey, welcome.
We work
Tori.
together.
Hi.
How are
Nicole,
you?
is your special person here, Nicole?
Yes, my mother's somewhere out there. I saw
Woohoo.
her.
Welcome, Mom.
Yeah, see what distance learning does when everybody's at home. Even my mom can come. I'm always trying to explain everything to her, and she's like, I just need to see you talk about it. I don't really understand what you do, so this will be good for her.
So then someone was asking if you talk about age dating. So if I don't know if you're talking about absolute dating, relative dating, methods of age dating. And there's another one shared out there where students have cards for different events in evolution, different firsts in evolution, and putting those in order to predict the evolutionary order.
And a book study idea.
Yep. So we're going to take about another minute or so before we get started, but just to give you a little warm-up question, because we want you to be thinking here and thinking about questions. This is my question for you. If you're a frequent viewer of our webinars, or if you're a first-time viewer, what are some topics that you would love to see us do for our webinar series? We're really planning our webinar series out through this time next year almost. So what would you like to see in terms of webinar topics? Type those into the chat box, please. I'm catching up on the notes here. Mandana, if you're going to use the interview idea, you'll want to look up the if-then ambassadors, if-then STEM ambassadors. There's an entire set of modules around one of those ambassadors, who is Hope Jiren, and there is a activity there that does interview and combines that with a timeline. And there will be 3 more of those coming up soon, and that's what we'll be talking about on our May webinar, so that's a little preview, but one of those is available right now if you want to jump out there and find it. I'll get the link into the chat box at some point here. Okay. Well, I have top of the hour, so I think we're going to go ahead and get started with today's webinar. So welcome in, everybody. Thank you very much for joining us. I know we're all working in unusual circumstances from our homes and unusual places, and there may be things like cats walking across keyboards and moms popping in and kids popping in throughout the course of our webinar. So welcome, and we'll all get through this together. So this webinar is being recorded, and today's webinar is entitled How to NGSS-ify the Question Formulation Technique, a Deep Dive. And this is the second in our mini-series for March. The first webinar in this mini-series, which was not a prerequisite, was held on March the 5th, and that is recorded, and I'll show you the link to get to that if you'd like to go back and view that or review that. Go ahead to the next slide, John. Thanks very much. So a couple of introductions here. I'm Aida Awad, and I'm joined by Carla McAuliffe, who's the Executive Director of NESTA, and Ed Roback, who is the Education Outreach Director for American Geosciences Institute. And today behind the scenes with us at CERC is John McDarris. Welcome back to support us, John. We're really happy to have you back. And our presenters today for the webinar are Nicole Bolduc from Ellington Public Schools and Sarah Westbrook from the Right Question Institute. We'll be going through the webinar, then we'll save some time at the end for discussion and question and answer. And then at the end, we'll provide also a link to the post-webinar survey, which is really important information for us. Go ahead and advance the slide, John. Thank you. So our upcoming webinars on April 9th, we have the second in another mini-series of webinars, which is going to be presented by Michael Hubenthal from IRIS, and it will be entitled Beyond Earthquake Locations, More Modern Seismology in the NGSS Classroom from IRIS. And if you weren't able to join us for his first webinar back in February, you can go back and take a look at that in our archives, but just really fascinating uses of the IRIS tools for more geoscience than just earthquakes. So I think you'll be fascinated by that and interested in that. And then on May 14th, as I've been teasing all along, the If Then Ambassadors Curriculum Connections from the American Geosciences Institute and the Lyda Hill Foundation will be demonstrated, and we'll take a tour through there and give you guys a really good feel for what that curriculum is all about and how you can use that in the classroom. And then there's a link to all of the archived versions, so bit.ly/webinar NGSS. On that page, you'll find 5 years now of NGSS-ESS webinars. So please dive in there and enjoy those. There is just a lot of great pedagogy and a lot of great resources there available for you. Next slide, please. And don't forget, throughout the course of this webinar, please go ahead and type your questions, your thoughts, your ideas into the chat box. We'll try to keep up with those. They've been kind of flying in here, so we'll do our best to keep up with those. And if we miss one, type it in again. We don't want to miss anybody's questions. So today's presentation, how to NGSS-ify the question formulation technique, a deep dive. And I'm going to turn it over to Nicole and Sarah at this point. Ladies.
Okay. I'm just going to share my slides here and get started.
And as you're sharing your slides, I'm going to ask that everybody keep their microphone muted during the presentation. And if you have problems with bandwidth, first thing to do is turn off your camera.
Okay. All right. So Aida already did a brief introduction, but I'm Nicole Bolduc. I teach 7th grade science at Ellington Middle School. And I'm in my 17th year of teaching science, so a lot of time to experiment with things and try out different things with my kids. And then I'll let Sarah say a few words about herself too.
Well, hi everyone. I'm Sarah Westbrook. I'm the Director of Professional Learning at the Right Question Institute. I am very lucky to be working with Nicole. I'm really here as the question formulation technique and the inquiry person, but Nicole has done just an amazing job in her classroom, NGSS-ifying and tailoring what we do at the Right Question Institute to really make it sing in her class. So I'm excited. I'll be monitoring the chat box and keeping Nicole in the loop about what you all are saying.
Thank you, Sarah. We also, too, before we start, we just want to acknowledge Aida and Edward and Carla and Mitchell and also John for helping us with all of the technology and just helping us set everything up. We're very grateful to be able to have this opportunity. So thank you very much. And we do have Twitter. So if you need to reach me, my handle's on there, the Right Question Institute, and then Sarah as well. So feel free to tweet us. If you have any further questions after the presentation, we're happy to connect with you through Twitter. If you see this little blue chat box along the way, it means that we would love to hear your thoughts through the chat box. So I'll remind you when it pops up, because there's a couple places throughout the seminar where we would love you to weigh in, and we'd love to hear from you. The first chat box is right here. We would love to know who's here right now. So if you could go in the chat box and tell us who you are and how you are in the education world. Are you a teacher? Are you a coach? what do you do in the educational world, and where are you from, if you wouldn't mind sharing. So I'll give you about a minute and a half or so, and then Sarah can maybe read some of those chats to us.
Yeah, I'll read them as they come. We've got Douglas from Denver Public Schools, Cynthia from California. We've got, everybody is putting in at the same time. We've got Nevada, Michigan, Maryland, Maine, Detroit, Connecticut, lots of friends from neighboring areas in Connecticut, San Jose, California. We've got Colorado, Minneapolis, Virginia, Yukon, Massachusetts, Las Vegas, this is South Dakota, Colorado, Yukon. Well, welcome to everyone.
Awesome. Yeah, welcome. It's so cool to have people from all over the place. That's wonderful.
And I know we have people in the room. We have some people in the room who have done a lot of work with the question formulation technique, and I've seen you on Twitter, so it's great to see you in the virtual room too. We have Alaska also, Massachusetts, Indianapolis. Wow, so welcome to everybody.
And actually, this would be a good point too, if we could put the poll up real quick, just to see who here attended the first. So you can see it just popped up. Did you attend our previous webinar? If you could just quickly answer yes or no, just so that Sarah and I know where everybody's at. Okay. And Sarah, are you able to see the poll?
I can't see it.
Okay.
Can you see it?
I'll push it out just in a second. So.
Okay. I can see the results.
And Nicole, we have self-described Nicole groupies in the room today.
Oh, nice. Thank you. I feel flattered.
We've got someone from warm and sunny Arkansas. I'm jealous.
I know, that sounds nice.
Sunny.
It's cold and sunny here in Connecticut, but well, right now we're at 65% no and 29% yes, but there's 4 people that actually watch the recording.
Great.
So that's good to know, because that means that we can just spend a couple extra minutes just quickly recapping what we had talked about in the other one, just so that when I pick up where I'm going to pick up, we have everybody on the same page. Great, thank you for answering the poll. Okay. Just the agenda for today is I'll do a quick recap of the QFT webinar that Sarah and I gave on the 2nd. And then I'm really excited to dive deep into what I do in the classroom with my students. And I'm going to be using the phenomena of how do eggs become chickens or other living things, which I've been working on with the Next Gen Storylines crew. And I can explain a little bit more about them later. And then reflecting and pre-planning possibly for your potential opportunities to use QFT with your students. And now that we're in this distance learning, perhaps virtually, some of you might have questions around that. And then finally, how do students feel about asking questions? If we have time, I do have a video clip of myself interviewing students about how they feel about using the QFT. So hopefully we'll get to that video clip. If we don't, it is on the slides and you can always watch that. I just want to give acknowledgement to some of the resources that I've been using in my classroom and then for this seminar. But I use open SciEd materials a lot. It's free and open resources. I also use a lot of resources from the Right Question Institute, the Next Gen Science Storylines, which is where the chicken phenomena came from. And then Paul Anderson's The Wonder of Science is also where I got some of the ideas from that I've been using in my classroom and that I'll be sharing with you in the webinar today. And also when I use the QFT resources, you can always go to their website at rightquestion.org. They have a lot of resources, classroom examples, instructional videos, planning tools, and templates. So it's a wealth of resources that you can access for free. And because they're free, they are Creative Commons licensed, but Sarah and I just asked that you cite their website on their on the papers that you might create, or if you present on any of these things, just to cite them, just because it is Creative Commons license. Anything to add to that, Sarah?
You covered it.
Okay, all right. And Sarah is going to take you through this slide too.
So just briefly, there's a lot of reasons why asking questions is important. If you are working with the next generation science standards, that's something that you've probably given some thought to. So just a very quick taste of some of the research out there. A lot of you might know that 3 and 4-year-olds are asking between 200 and 300 questions a day. That's over 10,000 questions a year and roughly 30 questions per hour. And so that's at home, a lot of that research. By the time they're in school, that question asking drops precipitously. So even 4-year-olds are asking fewer questions when they're in a school setting, a formal school setting. And by 12 to 18, the research is very sparse. A lot of it is non-existent because it's very difficult to research a phenomena that you can't see, that actually isn't happening. So the research we do have shows us that 12 to 18-year-olds are asking fewer than 2 questions an hour. Do you want to go to the next slide, Nicole?
Sure.
A
person popped up.
an adolescent person, as they're wont to do. And then in an hour, a standard hour of instruction, this is based on a group of 25 students, educators are asking 120 questions per hour. An entire group of students are asking about 2. And so everything that we're trying to do is figuring out how can we better support every student to be asking more questions and to sort of tap into some of that curiosity they had when they were 4 years old. And doing that is not, it's not for lack of trying. It's a difficult skill to develop, and it takes some intentional, deliberate work. So that's why what Nicole is sharing today is so important.
Which leads me to the next slide, which is what is the question formulation technique. And I'll be going through each of these bullet points throughout the rest of the seminar, showing you how I do these specific explicit steps with my students. But the steps basically are that the students are able to produce their own questions, improve their questions, strategize on how to use their questions, and reflect on what they've learned and how they learned it. And I've been scaffolding, playing around with these steps quite a bit over the past few years, and I've figured out ways to get students to be able to produce good questions that you're going to need them to ask in order to figure out a Q focus, or in the NGSS world, of phenomena. So I'm going to dive in first with the first step, which is, in order to do this, you do need a Q focus, which is, in, again, the NGSS world, it's typically a phenomena. And just to kind of help you with how do I find a phenomena, a good phenomena, one that I can engage my students with, that are going to help my students learn the standards of the NGSS, is usually, again, I use a phenomena that's captivating to students, typically provocative, that can capture their attention and bring them through a journey over, usually it's a couple of weeks, couple of months, I guess it depends. If you're doing a small phenomena, it could be a couple of days. But it should be something fairly simple in the way that they should be able to watch it and be curious about it right away. I usually find a phenomena that's related to the grade level DCIs, or the disciplinary core ideas, the performance expectations, and that also is going to lend opportunities to having students do the cross-cutting concepts like finding patterns, cause and effect, and science and engineering practices that will lend itself to mathematical thinking and all of those acronyms that have a lot of bullet points under them. But these are all, these are the 3 Ds of the NGSS. Under this box here, I have all of the resources, or some, there's many more than this, that I use to help me find a good Q focus. Paul Anderson's The Wonder of Science website, and all of these are links, so if you were to click on these later, it will bring you right to the website. The Wonder of Science, Paul Anderson has a tab where you can click on it, and he has phenomena built into his website. Open Science has open resources with phenomena as well. National Geographic is a great place to scan and look for phenomena. They're always talking about interesting things in science or in any subject. Live Science, I found, has really catchy titles on their articles, and I find sometimes I've read a title and thought that would make a great phenomena because it makes me wonder when I read the title itself. I also have a blog that I wrote for the teaching channel, which I'm circling with my mouse right now, which you could also read for even more tips on how to find a cue focus. And then, of course, like I said before, I've gotten some phenomena and used some of the next gen science storylines. So you don't have to invent phenomena by yourself unless you see something and you find it to be a good phenomena, but there are a lot of resources out there to help you so that you're not feeling like you have to start from scratch and reinvent the wheel. There's already a bunch that exist. So I'm going to dive into my classroom example. Here's the deep dive part. I'm using the next gen storylines phenomena, which just got released, I want to say 2 years ago. My teaching partner and I have been using this phenomena for the past 3 years because we've been piloting it for the next gen storylines. And sadly, I'm not sure we're going to get to it this year. It might have to be a distance learning experience, but we hatch chicks. So it's going to be not the same, but we'll see if we can make it work virtually this year. But the first thing that I did, of course, is I looked at the performance, or that next gen storylines did, is they looked at the performance bundles. So here's the different life science bundles, and that's the phenomena that matches those things. And the cue focus that I used with my students is eggs can become chickens or other living things. And you can see in the graphic that you see the egg and it either becomes just an egg, like just a fried egg on the top right, or it develops into something living. So I actually wait to dive into the QFT. I don't jump in right away. I do different primers with students first. And this is a step that I added in a couple of years ago, and we'll talk about why a little bit later. But the first thing that we do is we watched, especially for this phenomena, we watched videos of people raising chickens, harvesting eggs. We watched chicks hatching, and then I had students write down noticings and wonderings. And then we talked about the noticings and wonderings. I'm really big into having science discussions in class, collaboration. So a lot of times they'll talk in small groups and then we'll talk as a whole class. And we shared our noticings and wonderings. And then we also discussed why people would even raise chickens. And you can see on the bottom, that's a chart of what students came up with noticings and wonderings and why people might raise chickens. So we started with just why are people raising these chickens and what happens. And then we talked about things that we would need to raise chickens. So at this point, I still haven't told them that we are going to do this. I make them almost have to earn their way there, because we don't just all of a sudden raise an animal. We have to work our way towards there. What's the reason for that? Why would we need to do that? And I'll get to where we came up with that idea in a little bit. But I suggested that I go to the grocery store and pick up eggs, and the students were all like protesting, no, you can't go to the store, those eggs, they don't hatch, that's wrong, don't do that. And it was really neat to see them really excited about me not going to the grocery store. So they already had some wonderings about why the grocery store eggs aren't going to be able to hatch, or at least in their experiences, why they might not hatch. On the bottom of the slide, you can see that I also had students draw initial models of how an egg becomes something living and how an egg does not become something living. So you can see their initial thinking and their initial explanation. So this is, again, all before the QFT. And still before the QFT, we got together in a circle and we shared our models first in small groups, and then we shared them as a group, and we call it a consensus model. So the top right picture is just one part of our consensus model. So we sit in a circle and I record ideas that students have, agree and disagree on, and I pretty much record everyone's ideas for the piece of equity, and I put it up in the classroom, and then we vow to keep revising this model as we learn new things. Another really big important piece here is that we made a list of related phenomena, because I don't want the students' questions for the QFT to just be about chickens and eggs. Of course, we know that the NGSS standards are beyond that and more general than that. So we want to make sure that students are learning other things too and asking about other things too. So you can see on the right where related phenomena, that kids came up with lots of other related phenomena, including human things too. Weight gain, some even brought up global warming, which was really interesting that they connected that to the eggs. And it's really neat how kids are making connections beyond just what they see in front of them. So once we do those 8 steps, we are ready to launch almost into the QFT process. I put this slide in just to show everybody that the norms in my classroom are really important, that when we have these big discussions together, I took this from Open SciEd and I did modify it, but we keep going back to these norms throughout the year about being respectful and equitable, that everybody's ideas matter, that everybody should feel safe sharing their initial and later ideas, that we're committed to learning together, we're committed to always asking questions, and we're trying to move our thinking forward. So that's been a gold mine in finding this resource from OpenSciEd. I love it. I use it all the time with my students, and it's very simple for them to understand. So I'd like you just for a moment, the chat box is up. If you could write down how you think these preliminary steps, these primers, how do you think these things might help students do the QFT and ask questions? I'll give you 2 minutes if you want to add to the chat box, and then Sarah can share some of your thinking. So I'll set my timer so I don't lose track of time. So again, take the next 2 minutes to just think about how might these first 8 steps that I just showed you, how might they help students do the QFT and launch into question asking?
So we have some responses in the chat box. Do you want me to start reading?
Sure.
So we have, ooh, wow, everybody has so many responses. So it allows them to draw on background knowledge and experiences out of the classroom, making this knowledge more connected to everyday life. Observations and thinking about a process is part of developing questions. It helps create curiosity and gets them thinking more about the topic by doing all of those activities. It gives students structure so they can learn how to ask these sorts of questions because they probably haven't in the past. We did have a question, Nicole. How do you get kids to come up with related phenomena? Phenomenon.
I know. Yeah, that's a good question. It takes a little bit of practice with the kids. The first time we do this, because I do this for every phenomena, sometimes you can give them sentence starters or primers. So I might say to them on the slide with related phenomena, I might say, what else does this remind you of? Do you know of other situations in life that act like this or do this or look like this? And if I what's the word I'm looking for? If I prompt them, I guess is what I'm saying. If I need to prompt them, I do, and I think that that's okay. And we also go around in a circle, and everybody has to share at least one related phenomena. And sometimes once one child hears another one, then they suddenly come up with a bunch more. So I think that there's no harm in asking kids to think about other things and to really be explicit if you need to. But you'd be surprised, on their own, they typically are able to come up with quite a few things. But if you need to, you can definitely add more prompts to help you draw that out of them.
We have a lot of comments here about the equity piece and how important norms are. Encouraging students to really listen to each other probably promotes even more questions. Their ideas are likely to help them generate specific rather than general questions once they get to question asking. It instills that they are the scientists developing the questions, helps motivate students, keeps their interests high. Yeah, we have another question. How do you get the students involved in all of these activities? I'm the first NGSS teacher they have, so I feel like I'm starting from scratch, getting them to have these norms. So
Yeah.
There are some really great suggestions that other people are volunteering in the chat box.
Oh, good. Thank you.
Other people who Tori jumped in too, so other people who are doing this work, please feel free to jump in and offer ideas you have too.
Sure. And I actually did a podcast on how to set up all the routines with the next NGS Navigators podcast. So that's a good resource too. But really, I set up these routines at the very beginning of the year, and the kids catch on very quickly. And I have them come up with the norms. One thing that I actually do is I show them a video of a discussion from the year before, and I have my kids watch the next year, like the 8th graders, for example, do a discussion, and we talk about what are they doing well, what do they need to work on. And honestly, with that video alone, kids are able to come up with most of these norms. They notice more than one child's talking and they're listening to each other. So there are a lot of routines that you can instill in them, even in the middle of the year if you're jumping into things. And I use a slide deck, and I find that helps format things and scaffold things so that things flow for me and the students. I would really check out Open SciEd. Their open resources and Next Gen Storyline, they have all the routines built into their units, and I just feel that I learned from their units, and I learned how to structure things and set routines for my students. So those are really helpful resources that I've used. And if you want more answers, please definitely email me after, and I can definitely talk to you more, or redirect and show you different places too. But I agree with what everybody said. I think that the primers do help students come up with really great questions and questions that you need them to ask. I was also going to add that the initial model triggers a lot of questioning in their head because they're not sure if they're drawing things right or not. And I do tell them, jot down questions on the initial model if you're super stuck, and they can always use that question later in the QFT too. Even though it's not a formal question asking time, they're already asking questions. It's just sort of in that informal way. So before the QFT too, sometimes something that I do that really helps, and this is great especially for the beginning of the year when students are less familiar with the QFT, is I made this rubric. It could use some work. I actually would like it to be even more aligned with the NGSS science and engineering practices. So it's still a work in progress, but I made this to just have them set some goals before the QFT, and not yet mastery and exceeds, and different skills that they can do in order to ask better questions and be more engaged in the question asking process. So I did link this into the slides, so you can feel free to use it, change it, but it's still a work in progress, and I'd like to make it even better. But it is a great place to start if you would like to assess them on their question asking skills, since it is a science and engineering practice of asking questions. So you could assess them on asking questions. So the next thing, now we're ready to ask our questions. We're ready to produce our questions now that we've done our primers. So the general rules of the QFT that students are going to follow are that they are going to, or let me go to the next slide for that. The directions that I usually give to them are to generate scientific questions based on our initial model, our class consensus model, and our list of related phenomena. You can also add noticings and wonderings in there as well, but I want them to ask about a variety of things, not just the egg and the chicken, but all of those resources. So the rules that we use for the QFT are: ask as many questions as you can, do not stop to discuss or answer, record exactly as stated. So if they're working with a partner, they should not be changing any of the wording from their partner. They should honor what their partner has said, and they should change statements into questions. So there should be no sentences with periods. There should be sentences with all question marks. I usually give them about 5 to 10 minutes. As a teacher, you can decide how long you think they need, but it's sacred asking question time. There's no discussion. There's no trying to answer. They just are supposed to think of and produce and rattle off as many questions as they can. You can see in this picture, I usually use whiteboards, but you can use chart paper. Some people suggest digitally. I really like to be able to walk around and really look at what they're doing, but there are different ways. And in this distance learning, digital is probably the way to go at this point. But in the classroom, you can definitely format this any way you want. You could do partners, you could do alone. I usually give kids an option. The first time around, I usually have them do it together, but then I usually give them the option to work alone if they'd like to, because some kids are just more comfortable producing questions by themselves. So again, that's your option as a teacher. Those are your decisions. You know your students best and how you'd like to run that. So once they generated as many questions as they can, we're moving on to the step of improving our questions, because now we just have a whole bunch of questions. So we want to make sure that these are the questions that we need to push us further into learning about our phenomena and learning those DCIs of the NGSS. So I have played around a lot with this step, and I'm going to show you some of the things that I've tried in the classroom. So the first step that I show students, so imagine they have all their questions in front of them. So the first thing that I tell them to do is I say, mark questions that are about changing or comparing a variable with a hashtag. And I usually give them an example, and I usually talk them through this example, because depending on the age of the students, they may not understand what a variable is or what comparing means. So my example is usually not related to the current phenomena. I want them to see a different example. In this case, it was what would happen if we dropped the marble from a higher versus lower height. That was a previous phenomena we did. And if they do not have a question like this where they're comparing two different things, then they are supposed to change or write a question that includes changing a variable. And as we know, this taps into the cross-cutting concepts of cause and effect and the science and engineering practices of investigating. So you are you are introducing, or you're making those questions be geared towards those practices and cross-cutting concepts by simply asking them to mark off or ask questions that purposefully have a variable in them. And then, as we know as scientists, the variable questions can turn into investigations later, which is going to be important. So that's the first step. So students go ahead and they hashtag different questions, or they write a new question. Sometimes I'll have students share. I'll just pause and say, okay, who would like to share a variable question you have? And we'll usually ask for volunteers. And then if a student doesn't understand, usually they hear an example and then they can change a question or add a question. The next step that I have them do is I say to them, okay, now you're going to mark questions that relate to but aren't about the eggs and the chickens specifically with a $sign, and you can use any little symbols you'd like. I just happen to pick hashtags and $signs. So my example here is what causes me to go fast down a hill on my bike instead of what caused our roller coaster to fail. Our roller coaster was a previous phenomena. So in that example, I didn't want them to point out questions about roller coasters. I wanted them to point out questions about other related things. So in this case, they would be putting $signs next to any questions that aren't about the eggs and aren't about the chickens, but maybe are about frogs or are about humans or about something else, so that we're not just getting a bunch of questions about eggs and chickens, because we want to leverage and make more connections to the standards. So again, the direction is if they don't have this, they should write or change a question and improve that question to include having some related phenomena. And then my next step, this is a new one. I just tried this with them a few weeks ago and it worked out pretty well. I really wanted to leverage, again, cross-cutting concepts. And in this case, I chose patterns. I didn't want to do too many things with cross-cutting because I think it could be overwhelming to keep scaffolding over and over again. So in this case, I decided to really focus on patterns because it ended up being a really good one for the chicken unit. And you might find that there's other cross-cutting concepts that work better for different phenomena. But in this case, I said to them, some of your questions might help us figure out patterns. Read through your questions and see if any of them include patterns and mark them with what you see on the chart. So I used Paul Anderson's site for this, The Wonder of Science, and I took his ideas for this. And he had mentioned that there's time patterns, spatial patterns, properties patterns, and relationship patterns. And I had kids go down their board and mark off any questions with TP, SP, PP, which I thought was funny, and RP. And then again, I had some students share just in case there were students that were confused. And if they didn't have any pattern questions, which honestly was very rare because this covers a lot of ground, then they had to fix a question, revise it, or they had to add a new question. And then I knew for sure that we had questions about patterns because of this step, which made me feel better as their teacher because I want them to learn how to understand patterns better because that's one of our cross-cutting concepts. And one of our final improved question steps is to mark any questions with a smiley face that you believe somehow connect back to our previous phenomena that we've learned that year. So in this case, my year so far, we've done roller coasters, we did the fancy cup phenomena from OpenSide, which was thermal energy, and then we're doing one right now, distance learning style, about hearing and about sight and about sound, which is Jay in the bottom right corner. He echolocates, so I had students write down, or I would have them write down smiley faces next to related past phenomena. And it's pretty amazing. A lot of kids are able to, they have questions about energy and kinetic energy and thermal energy. And they're really excited when they see that they actually are pulling in past knowledge from what we did this year to the questions that they have just asked. So it's really neat to see them make those connections, and they get really excited because they're like, I wonder if this has anything to do with kinetic energy. And they just start to see that everything's connected, especially through energy. And then finally, this slide is pretty optional. I have found that I haven't had to use it lately because my students are really asking relevant questions, but just in case you get a couple of off-topic questions, I do have cross off any questions that you do not think will, or sorry, that you think will not help us figure out more about how the eggs will become chickens. So if you're afraid that they might have some questions that aren't going to leverage the phenomena, then at this point they can just cross those off and then you're kind of done with those. But I had students, I had to take it out of my last QFT because kids were like, well, am I supposed to be crossing something off? I don't know what to cross off. Everything's related. And I had to clarify, no, only if you do. Don't worry about it. That's wonderful if you don't. So it just depends. Later on in the year, they don't usually need this slide. So now that we have marked all of our questions off and we've improved our questions to make sure we have patterns and we have cross-cutting concepts and all of these different things that are in the NGSS standards. It's time to strategize, and it's time to prioritize our questions, because some kids have asked, so I've had some students ask 50 to 60 or 20 to 10, and it's time to just narrow down and zero in on a couple of questions. So the way that I do that with students is sometimes you could either come up with these categories together. Usually we come up with these during the consensus model step, where we do a model together as a class. But I figured that in the model with the egg, we have that point A of the model is where you have just the egg. And then over time is point B of the model, where the egg is sitting around over time. Point C is more time has passed, and point D is related phenomena that don't quite fit into the above category. So it's really a time related scale, like the egg at first, to letter C is when the egg either is going to hatch or not going to hatch. And those are the categories that the kids are going to categorize their questions into. So if their question is about the egg being laid at first, they would put an A next to the question. If the question's about the egg sitting around over time, they could mark their questions with a B. And if their question is about the egg over at the end, when it's going to hatch or when it's not going to hatch, they can put a C. And this further helps them organize their questions into what steps of the phenomena their question fits in. And if their question doesn't fit in, we don't have to disregard those questions, but sometimes those are really great related phenomena questions that you might actually get to later through enrichment, or maybe you'll have time to get to some of those questions. So instead of throwing those questions out, I have them put a D next to those questions. And we call that like a parking lot. And then I have them circle their 3 questions. So if they're working alone, they can make the decision alone. If they're working with a partner, they can do that too. But I have put in some guidelines for what those 3 questions should be. I usually require that one of the questions has to be a variable or a pattern question, just to make sure, again, that we are leveraging cross-cutting concepts, cause and effect, investigations. So they have to circle one that is hashtag or P. They also have to circle one that's related phenomena. And then the 3rd question can be any question they want, so that I do have choice in there for students that want that choice, like every student would want choice. But that way you're at least narrowing down and having kids ask what you need them to ask to learn. And then I'll show you the paper in step 2 that I have created this year to help. I'll show you that in a couple of slides. But now that we've gone through all those steps, if you could use the chat box again and share how might the improve and strategize steps in the QFT help students ask the right questions. So all of those steps that I took you through with find the patterns and find the questions with the variable, how do you think that those are going to help students ask the questions that you need them to ask? If you want to take a couple minutes to chime in the chat box, that would be great.
We have give them guidelines of how to assess their questions, narrow down the questions. It might help them focus and consider a different perspective, give them time to revisit, clarify their own thinking, helps direct their thinking. It can help them look more specifically what the overall question is and focus their attention to that idea. They're learning how to ask scientific questions by doing, helps narrow the focus towards the phenomena and lead to what their next steps will be.
Awesome. And that's a good way to leeway even into the next steps, because I know that a lot of people want to know, wow, I have all these questions, but what do we do now? I just wanted to show you a quick sample of the questions that some students are asking. There were over 200 questions between all of my 5 classes, and we do digitally I put them up on a wall. I'll show you a picture of that in a little bit, but I also keep a digital record with students. And you can see that they're asking just really in-depth scientific questions because of all that scaffolding that helped them get there. But how are eggs fertilized? How do chickens start off edible on the inside? Does kinetic energy, potential energy, thermal energy relate to eggs in any way? Which was awesome for me to see, because that was our other phenomena with roller coasters and thermal energy. So they're really trying to make those connections. Are molecules involved in the development of chickens? Again, that clearly came from make sure you ask about our past phenomena. Do eggs need different temperatures? Again, relating back to other phenomena. So I just wanted to show you the power of the results that you get when you do some of these steps to help them strategize their questions. This is a sheet I've been playing with too for a couple of years now. It started as one version and now it's at this version at this current time. But I find that this sheet really helps us with our prioritization step. So I have them list their 3 questions below in the first column. And then they do have to write down whether it's a hashtag, $ or pattern question or a choice question. And then they have to categorize it. Is it A, B, C? I just realized that's E. That should be a D. And then I also just added in a main topic, but I'll show you that the last 2 columns is going to come with our next step. So usually at this point, they're just filling out the first 3 columns just to record their questions. And I usually have them keep this in there. I keep a science notebook with them. So we also, a lot of people were wondering, how do you create the driving question board? So you can see that we're in our circle in this picture, and the driving question board is on the bulletin board right over here. And I do combine all 5 classes onto one driving question board, but I do separate classes digitally just so that kids aren't overwhelmed by looking at all of the questions on their computer screen. But we do find it to be fine for us to have all of them on a bulletin board, but some teachers like to separate them by class, totally your choice. We actually take turns and every student goes around, again, the piece of equity again. Every student has to read a question out loud and every student has to go up and put it onto this board right here. And you can see this is the chicken. The picture I just showed you was from our sound unit. Since I haven't gotten to this yet this year, this is a picture from last year, but you can see that every student has added a question. You can see that it's actually incorporated into our consensus model. So they are within their categories. So egg first laid, these are all questions related to the egg first laid. These are all questions related to the egg over time. And these are all questions related to the end of the process. And then way over to the right are the related phenomena ones. I just couldn't get it all in one frame. But that is what our driving question board looks like, and the students constructed it with me. Or really, they just did it themselves. I just had them take turns. And now we're ready to move on to our last 2 columns. So at this point, we have our questions created, we have them categorized, we have them prioritized, and I have them sit down by themselves with their notebook, or they can work with a partner, and they go through their questions and they decide what's their main topic of their question. I just added this column this year because I found that when I jumped from what's your question and what do you want to do next, they struggled a little bit with how do I figure this question out. So with the main topic, if the main topic is temperature, they were much more easily able to come up with specific experiment ideas or investigation ideas related to temperature and eggs or temperature and water or whatever it might be. So I found that this was a good added step that's been helping students a lot this year. There's a copy of this sheet in the slides. You can feel free to use it and change it. But I did find that it really helps them come up with some investigation ideas, which you want them to be able to do. So our next step is, sorry, the title on the top is cut off for me, but what we do is we come up with our investigation ideas. So we sit down again in a circle, and at this point they have already filled out their paper so that they've done some pre-thinking about what they would like to do further. And we sit in a circle and I write down their ideas on the board, and again, into the equity thing, I do have everybody go around and share an investigation idea. And if someone has already said someone's idea, I say, that's fine, just repeat it. You could even say, just like John said, I also think that we should do this, or build off of somebody, but I don't want them to be afraid that just because someone said their idea already that they can't share. I believe that they should be listening to each other and repeating what other people say. And I think that that's just as valuable as coming up with your own idea. You can see here in orange that they came up with some really great investigation ideas, which I was glad because those were my ideas too. And I was hoping, you always hope as a teacher, like, please say these things because these are the things that we need to do because this is written into the unit and we want to kind of drive them in the direction of where they need to go. But luckily, because their questions were so focused and relevant, they came up with great ideas like, let's hatch chicks. And I said, wow, do you guys really think we should do that? And I already knew we were going to hatch chicks, but their questions lent themselves to hatching chicks. So they owned the idea, but I already knew we were going to do that, which was really great that our ideas meshed, which was perfect because I had already bought some supplies. So you can predict what kids are going to say, especially if you bring them through the scaffolding step in the QFT. They wanted to research how to raise chickens because they knew we're not going to raise them if we don't know how to take care of them. They wanted to watch videos of birds taking care of their eggs. They wanted simulations because we'd done so many simulations in the classroom. They wanted to use microscopes and magnifying glasses, which are exactly what we were going to do to check out cells and all that stuff. Our last step after we come up with investigation ideas is just to reflect on the whole process. So I'll often bring them back to this rubric, and usually this rubric, I would probably put it right after they're done with asking questions, just because this might be what I just showed you, the investigation ideas, is probably a few days after they ask questions, but they can come back to this rubric and they can self-assess, did I ask a lot of questions or not? And they can even have a peer assess them too, and just kind of look back at their question asking skills to see how they did and how they can improve in the future. And you can see that we do the investigations. Of course, you're going to get some ideas that, you know, you're not going to be able to do, but you can always, I always steer them in just different directions. So if they have an idea that we know isn't going to work in the classroom, we talk through it and we say, is that realistic for our classroom, or can we do something else? Do we literally have to do what the phenomena is, or can we do other things that are going to help us learn about the phenomena? So the kids are usually really good at thinking outside the box and thinking beyond what their initial ideas are. But we did hatch the chicks, which I'll miss this year if we don't get to do that. And we did look under microscopes, and we did study the development of an organism in an egg, which lends itself to some of those cross-cutting concepts and DCIs of the NGSS. So we were able to do a lot of their investigation ideas, which again came from their questions. Just so we don't forget about their original questions, we also do summary charts, and I have them after each investigation. We revisit what was the question we were trying to figure out. So this, what were we wondering? What investigation number was it? Based on our evidence, what did we figure out? What did we do to figure out that evidence? And how does this connect back to chickens and eggs? And what are new questions? So the question asking does not have to stop at the QFT. It shouldn't stop. There should always be more questions, because an investigation is going to make you wonder even more. So it's pretty important, and I can show you right here is, these are some summary charts I posted in the classroom. This was the cup phenomena, but you can see how we are always posting our learning, revisiting our QFT questions. What did we figure out? What did we not figure out? We can also see down here, I do post resources. I let them use them during assessments, because my assessments are usually related phenomena, but they can use these to then transfer over. So being able to revisit those QFT questions, what did we figure out? How did we figure this out? What else do we want to know, is another important step to keep doing after the QFT process. And taking stock of questions in the middle of the phenomenon at the end. This is just a simple chart I put together. What are 2 questions we've answered so far? Draw or write out as much of an answer as you can at this point. What did we do to figure these questions out? What sorts of activities did we do? What questions are we not at yet? Where do we have to go next? So it's really, I think, important too to be doing this step maybe every 3 or 4 investigations, or whenever you feel like it's needed to happen. And this slide just summarizes everything I just said. So I won't go through everything, but you can see on the left side, pre-QFT, this is what I do with students. I also gave you tips for whether I have them do it individually or whole class. The middle column is what do we do during the QFT, small group, individually. And then the last column is what do we do after the QFT. And that way, if you needed to print this out and have a guide, this can help you through all of those steps to make the QFT as rich of a process and productive as a process as possible. And now that you've seen the QFT process from beginning to end, are there any topics or phenomena that you can imagine using with your student, or even during distance learning? If you'd like to weigh in the chat box and let us know, has this inspired you to try this out? Have you been using it? Are you going to use it? Are you planning on using it anyway? If you want to take a couple minutes to weigh in our chat box, it would be great to hear from you.
Tori says, did a QFT day 2 of distance learning on genetic technologies. We have, someone said flooding as a topic.
Awesome.
Observing plant phenology. Did I say that correctly? Yeah.
I think so.
Okay. Adding QFT to curriculum about watersheds and earth systems. There are lots of people in here who've already used the QFT but are finding pieces in what you did that they'd like to add. A lot of people enjoyed the rubric and the setting norms. Yep, goal setting. Hazards is as an example of something to use the QFT with. Yep.
Cool.
Yeah, so lots of ideas in here.
No, that's great. It just helps because I used to get, when I first did the QFT and didn't do the strategizing steps, sometimes I would just get questions that we couldn't use and weren't really related to the phenomena. So I just had to think of ways to narrow things in a little bit. And it's been really helpful to do some of these steps to make sure that we're getting the questions that we need. Here's some distance learning ideas. I'm sure that you have even more things that you've tried. I haven't done a QFT distance learning wise yet. I might need to when I do chickens. But just some things that you could do over the internet is you could ask students to read an article, watch a video clip, really any way you can present your Q focus to them digitally. You could collect student questions with Google Forms, Padlet, Google Classroom, discussion streams, if you could go live and do Google Meets with them, Zoom, lots of different ways to do that. There are worksheets that Sarah let me know about on writequestion.org to help support distance learning. And like I'd already said, you can conduct a QFT in some of these virtual meeting spaces too. And Sarah, I don't know if you have any more ideas to add to that.
I would say that there's more coming. I mean, like everyone else in the country, we're adjusting to the new reality that we're in for the time being, and so we are coming out with some more distance learning and virtual learning with the QFT. You can have students ask questions individually. I mean, it's nice when there's a group because there are more voices and more ideas and collaboration, but they can ask questions individually, and there are all kinds of tools out there. So keep an eye on writequestion.org if you're looking for those virtual resources.
Cool. And my last slide really was any questions that you have for me or for Sarah that we can help you with.
And we do have, I took down, there were questions as we went, and I think you may have addressed some of them. But I thought there was a question of, do your routines evolve as the unit continues and over the years? I thought it might be helpful, Nicole, if you talked a little bit about, like some of what you shared today is the result of years of working with the QFT.
Yeah, I think, and Sarah and I talked about this in our last webinar, you don't have to start with the depth that I gave you today. You could definitely start with with open closed questions. You could have them just strategize by, are your questions open or closed, or are your questions, are you able to investigate your questions, or are they more observational questions? So if it's overwhelming for students to do all of those steps at first, you could just have them follow the QFT rules, but just give them one scaffold or one strategy step. Because it's true, Sarah, like Sarah said, I've been playing with these steps for a long time. But one thing that I do that almost works like magic is on the first time that I do a QFT with kids, I go to the Right Question Institute website, and there's a 12th grade humanities class doing the QFT. And I show the video to my students and I say, listen, I know they're not in science class. I know that they're in high school, but I want you to watch them and we're going to do what they're doing. And students are really good at modeling after other people, especially if the things are going really well in that example. Exemplars are great for anybody. And honestly, just watching that video and we talk through norms, students are able to do the QFT as early as September. That video is really helpful to watch other kids doing it first and then telling your kids that they're going to model after it. I think that that's a great way to get started. And then just do a couple strategy steps, maybe not do all the ones that I talked about today. That might be a lot.
We have, how long do you spend on this in class?
So all of the steps that I just shared with you from beginning to end, total, including the pre-QFT, during, and post, although post, of course, not including the investigations, it's probably 2 days or so. But those 2 days set us up for the rest of the phenomena. So I find that it's time well spent. But if you don't have 2 days, you could certainly modify and shorten steps if you feel like you need to. But I feel like the stronger our base is within those 2 to 3 days, the better the rest of the phenomena goes because we just launch off from there. But usually I do invest, we invest about 2.5 class periods going through these steps. And that includes setting up the driving question board and all that stuff.
I'm going to jump in here just for a second and ask Sarah if she would address one question, and then we're going to do our wrap-up slides. And then for those of you that want to hang around and get answers to a couple other questions, we'll hang around after our allotted time. But Sarah, there's one question here I thought you might address for Right Question Institute, and that is, do you have resources that help those who coach teachers with pedagogy?
We do, yeah. There are several blog posts at ratequestion.org that are from an instructional coach's perspective about the best ways to approach introducing the QFT to teachers, and sort of some resources around scaling it or diffusing a strategy throughout a school or district. And they are QFT specific, but we are coming out with a new course on professional learning this fall that I'm really excited about. And it's drawn from different people around the country in their work. So keep an eye out for that.
Great, thank you. So as I said, we're going to go ahead and do a little bit of a wrap up, and then we'll hang around afterwards if people would like to stay around and ask a couple more questions. So just give us a couple minutes to do kind of a wrap here. John, do you want to put our concluding slides up for us? Thanks. And we'll jump back into yours again
Okay.
at the end. Okay, thanks very much. So we do have a post-webinar survey. This is really helpful for us as we plan our webinars for the future. And this is also the only way that you can get a certificate of participation if you'd like one. So nagt.org/236-309. And we'll put that in the chat box. So please jump on that and complete that for us. Next slide, please. Upcoming webinars, April 9th and May 14th. I've told you about those two. I'm going to ask John to jump in here and tell you about a special webinar coming up next week. John?
Hi, everyone. So we have been planning for all of 24 hours and maybe a little longer, a new webinar that's going to be next week, and it's titled Suddenly Teaching Geosciences Online. And so it's going to feature a panel of 5 college and university faculty who have been teaching online for decades in some cases, who have tons of experience and expertise in teaching online, and they have agreed to share their expertise with those of us who are still trying to catch up in this new normal. So we're going to be running this webinar next Wednesday, April 1st, and it will start at 1 p.m. Pacific, 2 Mountain, 3 Central, and 4 Eastern. I put a link to the webinar website in the chat box, and you can find all the information about the panelists, as well as where to register. It's free, but we do need registration, just like these NGSS webinars, so we can get all the connection info out to the right people. But if you're interested in that, check out the website, and you'll find all the information there.
Perfect, thanks. Next slide, please, John. So there are 3 organizations that co-sponsor this webinar series. NAGT is one of them, and the webinar that John just spoke about is one of the NAGT webinar series webinars. So if you're interested in seeing more about the entire series, nagt.org/190616 in the middle of your screen. Next slide, please. Carla, do you want to talk about Nesta? Carla might be having trouble unmuting herself, so I'll go ahead and talk about this. Nesta, National Earth Science Teachers Association, is also a co-sponsor of this series, and you can reach them through nestanet.org, and also they're at the link there. And the next slide, John. The third co-sponsoring organization is the American Geosciences Institute and their Center for Geoscience and Society. Thank you to them. Next slide, please. And there's contact information for the 3 of us. So thanks everybody for joining us today, and we will hang around. So Nicole, do you want to have your slides back up again?
Sure.
Perhaps the one that was kind of the summary slide.
Oh yeah.
You know which one I'm talking about? I can give you a slide number otherwise. And if you have to leave, we absolutely understand, but if you'd like to hang around and ask a couple of more questions, we do have a couple more questions to ask. One of them, which I'm going to go ahead and pose at this point, is as you are going through the activities, there are so many places where you're asking students to access their prior knowledge and add on to their prior knowledge and operationalize their knowledge. And I'm just wondering, in terms of the metacognitive piece, are you also being deliberate and specific with them about, talking about, thinking about their own learning and their own thinking?
Sometimes I think when you mean like those strategizing steps, like, are your questions, do they mark one with a variable in it? A lot of times I will stop class at that point and we will share, what does this mean? What kind of question is that? Why is this important? Can somebody share with us? Because a lot of them do need some help with that. I probably could do more of the reflection piece of sort of that metacognition. I think that would be a neat thing to also build into it, beyond the goal setting. But I do stop and have us just think about what we're doing sometimes, just to make sure that we all understand what kind of questions are going to be important for us moving forward, if that answers your question.
Yeah, thanks. There's a question also, people wanted to have you remind us of Twitter handles. So if you could maybe put those on a slide and we'll put those up so people who want to get that can grab them off of one of the slides, that would be great.
Nicole, what's your Twitter handle? I couldn't remember it off the top. Is it Nicole J. Bolduc or?
Yeah. Yep. It's just my first name and then J and then Bolduc.
Okay, I'm going to put it in the chat box too.
Thank you.
One thing I would say is Nicole and I, when we were preparing for the webinar, I don't know that Nicole totally appreciates the amount of reflection that the students are doing, because it's like breathing to you or something. But just the way I saw students when I was in your classroom reflecting on the goals that they had set and sort of discussing how their partner did, the way that the driving question boards are made visible and posted, and that they keep coming back to those. There are all kinds of these little moments that you've embedded for the metacognition piece, and I do think that's a huge part of what makes it successful.
You're right. I think I just, I'm so used to doing that. That I should think about it more, because you're right. I think that they do a lot more of that than I noticed, because we've been doing it for a while.
It's like breathing. I mean, it's really amazing. So, my 2 cents.
Let's see, I'm seeing if I can look at the chat box now too.
Yeah, there are a lot of people saying thank you.
Yeah.
I have one question that I wrote down earlier about, do you ever come up with or post one driving question?
Usually, well, once we're done constructing the driving question board, usually we do have that overall question sort of on the top of it, just to remind us what's sort of the main topic, I guess you could say, or the Q focus. Even though the Q focus isn't typically a question, once you've done the QFT, probably posting that as a question is probably okay. So usually above their big model, it will say, how do chickens become eggs or not become eggs? But usually I do post the overall question, because that's what we keep coming back to. But usually I won't post it until everything's done.
It's an easy way to come up with a Q focus potentially too, is that you could take, whatever essential question or driving question you were planning to teach, it's fairly easy to turn that into a statement and ask questions about that, though maybe not quite as provocative as finding a phenomena.
Right, because if you say, like Sarah and I were working with the Q focus the other day, you could just say chickens and eggs sometimes become living things and sometimes don't become living things. So you've taken it from a question and made it more into a statement, so that kids have to ask questions about that statement rather than ask questions about a question, which makes sense.
I mean, the main point, I think, is that kids are used to answering your questions. They know how the game is played, right? They are used to giving answers. They're used to modeling their thinking on your thinking. And you're really trying to intentionally disrupt that for a moment in the classroom here, and giving them as much space as you can, at least with the initial burst of questions, that they can do some divergent thinking.
Yes.
There's one more question that is kind of a nuts and bolts question, but important nonetheless. I don't know if Joel is still on, but Joel had asked, what portions of the whole activity do you grade? Do you grade the summary chart? Are there other parts of it that you're actually assigning a grade to students on?
I think that you could assess question asking if you're having them do it individually. That might be more of like an end of the year, middle of the year, once they're well practiced. But I've seen teachers in my school grade the actual QFT process, which I think with practice, it is a standard for NGSS. I think that that's totally reasonable. Personally, I grade just assessments in my classroom. We're a standards-based school, so everything we do is pretty much practice until that assessment. So I don't grade the summary charts. We do the summary chart together as a class, or they do it individually, then we go over it together, but they use the summary charts to help them with the assessment. So I grade transfer tasks, meaning that I won't ever ask them about the chicken and the egg and grade that. We do that together, but I might ask them about another type of organism, and they have to transfer their understanding of the chicken and the egg to that or the other thing. Like I might ask them about a frog, or I might ask them about something else that develops, and they have to transfer that over. But because of our standards-based grading at my school, like I was just saying, we don't grade the practice, we just grade the formative assessments.
Great. Thanks very
But
much.
I think that grading the QFT is completely reasonable. If you give them a rubric and guidelines, I think that that's a skill that you can assess them on for sure.
My one thought is, you know, I like how you said, Nicole, that you don't want to grade their first QFT out of the group, right? Like asking questions is hard. You're rewriting a lot of conditioning, and yeah, you don't. You know, I think it's very tempting when you're the one who knows something. It's very tempting to judge questions as good or bad, or sophisticated or not sophisticated. But you know, be aware that sometimes that judgment becomes an obstacle of that child ever asking a question again in class. So there's always that tension there that, you know, assessment's really important, and it's important that kids see that the skill, that you value the skill, that it's a really important skill for you and for learning, but you want to, you know, just be very cognizant that you're walking a fine line because you're asking them to do something that makes them vulnerable.
Yeah.
Sure.
And like Sarah's saying, it would not be a good idea to do it at the beginning of the year at all.
I'm not sure I would.
No.
Well, thank you so much, Nicole and Sarah, for coming back and doing the second webinar in our mini series. We really appreciate it. And we're going to be making this entire video of this webinar and, of course, the first one available in the archive. But I think we also have captured much of the chat, because there are so many great links and questions and thoughts in the chat. So we'll be making that available to you as well. So thank you very much for joining us today, everyone. I hope you have a great rest of your day. Stay safe and stay well.
Thank you.
Bye, everybody.
Bye. Thank you.
Bye.
Bye.
Nicole, you did